The booking confirmation arrived at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. What they didn't know was that the charming coastal cottage they'd reserved belonged to me. I was reviewing monthly statements from my property manager when I saw the email, a standard automated confirmation for a 5-night stay booked under the name Julian Mercer plus one guest. The dates were March 15th through 19th, a long weekend I'd specifically told my husband I couldn't join him for because I had a medical conference in Boston. Julian had mentioned he might take a solo trip during that time, decompress with some hiking and reading, and I'd encouraged him to do something restorative. The cottage was in Mendocino, a 3-hour drive north of our home in San Francisco, perched on cliffs overlooking the Pacific. I'd bought it 4 years ago as an investment property, something separate from our shared finances that generated steady rental income and appreciated beautifully. Julian knew I owned a vacation rental on the coast. He'd never asked the exact location, and I'd never thought to specify. Now I understood why the details hadn't interested him. He'd been planning to use my own property to vacation with someone he'd carefully labeled as guest in the booking form. I sat at my desk staring at the confirmation email, my hands cold despite the warmth of our apartment. The booking had been made through the property management company's website, not a third-party platform, which meant Julian had specifically searched for rentals in Mendocino and somehow selected mine without recognizing it. The cottage was listed under my maiden name, Reese Coastal Properties, a small LLC I'd established for tax purposes. The listing photos showed the interior and views, but not the exterior address. I designed it that way for privacy, never imagining my own husband would book it for an affair. The coincidence felt impossible until I checked the booking details more carefully. Julian had filtered his search for properties with ocean views, hot tubs, and flexible cancellation policies within a specific price range that matched my cottage exactly. There were only 3 properties in Mendocino meeting those criteria during his dates, and mine had the best reviews. He'd chosen it because it was perfect for a romantic getaway, having no idea that every dollar he'd spent on the booking was going directly into my investment account. Julian and I had been married for 6 years. We'd met during residency, both of us exhausted junior doctors working 100-hour weeks at UCSF Medical Center. He'd specialized in orthopedic surgery, I'd gone into cardiology, and we'd built our lives around demanding schedules that left little room for anything except work and brief moments of connection between shifts. We'd talked about children someday, after we'd established our practices and paid down our student loans and achieved some mythical future stability that never seemed to arrive. We'd bought a condo in Noe Valley, split our finances equally, maintained separate retirement accounts and investment portfolios. The Mendocino cottage had been my project alone, purchased with money I'd inherited from my grandmother and managed as my personal asset. Julian had seemed pleased I had something that was mine, had never expressed interest in being involved with the property management or rental decisions. I'd thought his disinterest was respect for my independence. Now I wondered if it had been strategic distance, creating separation between his life with me and whatever he was planning with someone else. I'd had no suspicions before that email. Julian had been attentive recently, present in ways he hadn't been during the intense years of establishing his surgical practice. We'd had dinner together 3 times the previous week, rare for our schedules. He'd asked about my patients, remembered details about the research study I was leading, suggested we plan a trip together this summer. There had been no obvious signs, no lipstick on collars or suspicious phone calls or unexplained absences. But now I reviewed the past 6 months with different eyes and saw patterns I'd missed. The weekends he'd said he was at conferences but came home with no materials or new knowledge to discuss. The evening surgeries that ran implausibly late. The new attention to his appearance, expensive haircuts and cologne I'd thought were just professional investment. The way his phone was always face down now, password protected in ways it hadn't been before. Small details that had seemed innocuous individually, but together formed a clear picture I'd been too trusting or too busy to see. I didn't confront him that night. Instead, I emailed my property manager, a competent woman named Valerie Chen, who'd handled the cottage rentals for 3 years. I told her I'd be conducting a property inspection during the March 15th reservation, that I needed to check on some maintenance issues personally and would arrive unannounced on the 3rd day of the guest's stay. I asked her to note in the reservation file that the property owner reserved the right to access for maintenance and inspection as outlined in the rental agreement all guests signed. Valerie confirmed she'd update the file and asked if I needed her present for the inspection. I told her I'd handle it alone. Then I rearranged my conference schedule, moving my presentation to the morning session so I could leave Boston early, and booked a flight back to San Francisco that would get me to Mendocino by early afternoon on March 17th. I had 4 weeks to prepare, and I spent them documenting everything while acting completely normal at home. I watched Julian plan his trip with careful attention to details I now recognized as deception. He mentioned the hiking he was planning, showed me trail maps of areas near Mendocino, though he'd claimed his destination was vague. He packed hiking boots he'd bought recently, expensive technical clothing I'd never seen him wear. He seemed excited in a way that had nothing to do with solo reflection and everything to do with anticipated pleasure. The night before he left, we had dinner at our favorite Thai restaurant in the Mission, and Julian held my hand across the table while talking about how much he'd miss me during his trip. He said the time apart would be good, though, give us both space to focus on our work, and when we reunited, we could plan that summer vacation we'd been discussing. I smiled and agreed, and felt nothing except cold clarity about what was coming. I asked casual questions about where exactly in Mendocino he'd be staying, whether he'd rented a place or was doing hotels. Julian had been vague, said he'd found a small cottage through a rental site, nothing fancy, just a quiet place to decompress. I'd nodded and changed the subject, watching him relax at how easily the lie had passed. Julian left on the morning of March 15th, kissing me goodbye and promising to send photos of the coast. I went to work, saw patients, led a department meeting about our heart failure steady enrollment numbers, and acted like everything was normal. That evening, Valerie sent me the check-in confirmation. The guests had arrived at 4 p.m., collected keys from the lockbox, and entered the property. Security cameras I'd had installed last year for insurance purposes showed Julian's Tesla pulling into the gravel driveway, followed by a second car, a white Audi I didn't recognize. Julian emerged from his car looking relaxed, casual in jeans and a sweater I'd bought him for Christmas. Then the Audi's door opened and a woman stepped out. She was younger than me, maybe early 30s, with dark hair in a loose bun and designer luggage that suggested money. She smiled at Julian, easy and familiar, and he pulled her into a kiss that lasted long enough to make their relationship unambiguous. The cameras captured everything in clear daylight, timestamp and all. I saved the footage to my personal drive and continued watching. They'd spent the first 2 days exactly as I would have expected people on a romantic getaway to spend them. The security cameras showed them leaving for dinner, returning late, sleeping in until mid-morning. They'd used the hot tub both nights, visible from the camera angle covering the back deck. They'd walked the cliff path that ran along my property line, holding hands and stopping to photograph the sunset. They looked happy, comfortable with each other in ways that suggested this wasn't new, that whatever relationship they had included ease and affection and shared jokes. I watched the footage each evening after work, clinical and detached, documenting patterns and timestamps. On March 16th, I received a notification that they'd used the outdoor shower, the fireplace, and the sound system. They were enjoying every amenity my property offered, creating memories in a space I'd designed and invested in, completely unaware that I was monitoring their romantic escape in real time. I flew to San Francisco early on March 17th, landing at noon and driving directly to Mendocino. The coastal highway was beautiful that time of year, wildflowers covering the hillsides and ocean dramatic against the cliffs. I'd driven this route dozens of times for property inspections and personal visits, had always found it peaceful. Today it felt surreal, driving toward a confrontation I'd choreographed carefully. I arrived at the cottage at 2:30 p.m., parking my car on the road rather than the driveway. The Tesla and Audi were both there, and I could hear music playing from inside, something classical and romantic. I'd dressed professionally, black pants and a blazer, carrying a clipboard and camera to look official. I walked up the stone path I'd designed, past the native plants I'd selected, to the front door of my own property, and knocked firmly. Julian opened the door in bare feet and casual clothes, relaxed and off guard. His expression went through several changes when he saw me. Confusion first, then recognition, then panic as he understood what my presence meant. He'd started to say my name when the woman appeared behind him, asking who was at the door. She wore one of the cottage's complimentary robes, her hair wet like she'd just showered, completely comfortable in the space. I'd introduced myself calmly, said I was the property owner and was here to conduct a routine maintenance inspection as outlined in the rental agreement. Julian's face had gone completely white. The woman had looked confused, glancing between us, clearly not understanding why the property owner's arrival had caused such a dramatic reaction. I'd asked if I could come in, said this would only take a few minutes, and walked past them into my own cottage before either could object. The interior looked well used, evidence of their stay scattered throughout. Wine bottles on the counter from the local vineyard I'd recommended in the guest manual. Roses in a vase Julian must have bought in town, their luggage in the bedroom, clothes mixed together in ways that spoke to intimacy and extended familiarity. I'd taken photos methodically, checking each room with my clipboard like this was a standard inspection. The woman had followed me, trying to be polite, apologizing if they'd made any mess and asking if there was a problem with the property. Julian had stayed frozen near the entrance, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. I had finished my inspection tour in the living room, standing near the window with its perfect ocean view, and finally addressed the situation directly. I'd told the woman my name was Dr. Reese Garrison, that I owned this property as a rental investment, and that I couldn't help but notice the booking had been made by Julian Mercer, plus one guest. I'd paused, then added that Julian Mercer was also my husband of 6 years, and asked if she'd been aware of that detail when she'd agreed to this vacation. The silence that followed felt like falling. The woman, whose name I'd learn later was Simone, had stared at Julian with an expression moving from confusion to understanding to horror. She'd asked if what I'd said was true, her voice shaking. Julian had tried to speak, started several sentences that went nowhere, finally managed to say it was complicated and he could explain. Simone had cut him off, asked him directly if he was married. Julian had hesitated too long before nodding. Simone had made a sound between a laugh and a sob, said she'd been seeing him for 8 months, that he'd told her he was divorced, that he'd shown her photos of his condo, and talked about his life as a single surgeon rebuilding after his marriage ended. She'd said he'd told her about his difficult ex-wife who was a cardiologist, how the divorce had been amicable but sad, how he was finally ready to move forward with someone new. Every detail had been a careful mixing of truth and lies, using real facts about me and our life, but recasting them as past history rather than present reality. I'd listened to Simone's description of their relationship with clinical detachment. 8 months of dinners and weekend trips and integration into parts of his life I'd never seen. She'd met his surgical colleagues at hospital events, people who apparently knew to play along with his fiction of being divorced. She'd been to his condo, our condo, during times when I'd been traveling for conferences or working overnight shifts. She'd believed she was dating a successful, available surgeon who'd been honest about his past and his readiness for a committed relationship. Instead, she'd been the affair partner of a married man who'd constructed an elaborate alternate reality to facilitate infidelity. She turned to Julian, demanded he confirm or deny what I'd said. Julian had tried a few more weak attempts at explanation before admitting it was all true, that he was still married, that he'd lied about the divorce, that he'd been maintaining 2 separate lives for 8 months. Simone had slapped him, hard enough that the sound echoed in the cottage, then told him she was leaving immediately. I'd stepped back, let them have their confrontation without my interference. Simone had gone to the bedroom, thrown her clothes into her luggage with shaking hands, and returned to the living room with everything packed. She'd paused near me on her way out, said she was sorry, that she'd had no idea, that if she'd known he was married, she would never have been involved. I told her I believed that she was as much a victim of his lies as I was, just in a different way. Simone had asked if I'd known about her before today. I'd explained about the booking confirmation, about recognizing my own property in his reservation, about the security footage I'd reviewed. Simone had looked at the cameras I'd pointed out, visible in corners of the main rooms, and understood that everything about their romantic getaway had been documented by his wife. She'd left quickly after that, the Audi's engine starting and gravel crunching as she drove away too fast down the narrow coastal road. Julian and I had stood in the cottage alone, the space filling with heavy silence. He'd tried to apologize, to explain why he'd done it, to ask if we could talk about fixing things. I'd told him there was nothing to fix, because I was done with the marriage as of that moment. I'd said I'd be filing for divorce immediately, that I had documentation of his affair, including the security footage from this property, that he should expect to hear from my attorney within the week. Julian had asked about the cottage, whether I'd planned this exposure deliberately. I'd told him the truth. I'd said the booking confirmation had been genuine surprise, that I'd had no idea he was having an affair until I'd seen his name reserving my property with an unnamed guest. I'd said his choice to use my own investment for his infidelity had been cosmically fitting, a perfect demonstration of his arrogance and carelessness. He'd wanted to know if I'd told Simone deliberately. I'd said Simone had deserved to know she'd been lied to, that 8 months of someone's life had been wasted on a relationship built on complete fiction, and revealing the truth had been basic human decency. Julian had tried several more arguments, cycling through justifications about our lack of connection, the stress of our careers, how we'd grown apart. I'd let him talk until he ran out of excuses, then told him his rental period ended in 2 days and I expected the property returned in good condition per the agreement. I'd said he could stay or leave, but I was returning to San Francisco and would appreciate if he wasn't at the condo when I arrived home tomorrow. Julian had asked where he was supposed to go. I'd suggested a hotel, said he clearly had experience booking accommodations for secret activities. Then I'd left, walked back to my car with my clipboard and camera, and driven back down the coastal highway toward the city. The sun was setting over the ocean, painting everything gold and purple, and I'd felt lighter than I had in months, despite the wreckage of my marriage behind me. The divorce had proceeded quickly given our relatively clean finances and lack of children. My attorney had been efficient, using the security footage and documented affair as leverage to ensure favorable terms. Julian had kept his orthopedic practice and his retirement accounts. I'd kept the condo, the cottage, and my own investments. We'd split shared assets down the middle with minimal fighting because Julian's attorney had advised him that trying to contest anything would only drag out a process where he had no moral or legal standing. The divorce was finalized in 4 months, faster than some people's engagements. I'd heard through mutual colleagues that Julian had left UCSF, taken a position at a different hospital where his reputation wasn't shadowed by the affair story that had spread through the medical community. Simone had apparently told people about what happened, how she'd been lied to for 8 months and discovered the truth during a vacation at his wife's rental property. The story had particular resonance in a city where everyone knew someone with a vacation rental and everyone had opinions about honesty in relationships. I'd kept the cottage, continued renting it through Valerie's management company, and eventually started using it myself occasionally for actual decompression. I'd sit on the deck where Julian and Simone had used the hot tub, where they'd photographed sunsets and created memories they'd thought were private, and I'd feel nothing about them at all. The property was mine, had always been mine, and their brief presence there had been just another rental booking in a long series of temporary guests. I'd upgraded the security system, added more cameras, improved the landscaping with the settlement money from the divorce. The cottage had appreciated another 15% in the year since Julian's booking, proving once again to be an excellent investment. Reviews remained strong. 5 stars from guests who loved the views and the amenities and the attention to detail in how I'd designed the space. I'd started dating again, eventually, a professor of bioethics I'd met at a conference who appreciated both my work and my boundaries. We'd taken things slowly, building trust through honesty and time, and I'd told him the cottage story on our 5th date. He'd laughed at the cosmic justice of it, Julian booking his affair into his wife's property, and said it sounded like a story that should be told as a cautionary tale about lying poorly. I'd agreed it had a certain poetic symmetry, the way Julian's deception had collapsed specifically because he'd been careless enough to use my own resources against me. We'd spent a weekend at the cottage together, and it had felt completely different than watching those security videos of Julian and Simone. This time, the presence was invited, wanted, built on truth rather than fiction. The professor had asked if I felt strange being there given what had happened. I'd told him the truth. The cottage had been mine before Julian, had remained mine during his brief and stupid use of it, and would be mine long after he'd faded into irrelevant history. The property had always been about my investment, my vision, my future. Julian had been a temporary guest who'd overstayed his welcome and learned there were consequences for treating my resources like they were available for his exploitation. I'd continued working at UCSF, leading my research studies, seeing patients, building a career that had nothing to do with any marriage status. The cardiology department had promoted me to associate professor the same year my divorce finalized, recognition of my research contributions and clinical excellence. My colleagues knew about the affair and the cottage revelation because hospitals were small communities where personal stories circulated quickly, but they'd treated it as evidence of poor judgment on Julian's part, rather than any reflection on me. The story had actually gained me respect in certain circles, people who appreciated the justice of it, the way I'd handled the confrontation calmly and extracted myself from a dishonest marriage efficiently. Someone had even joked that I should add property owner doing inspection as a new technique for catching cheating spouses, though I'd pointed out the specific circumstances were unlikely to repeat. The cottage rental income continued funding my retirement account, building equity for a future that looked nothing like the one I'd imagined with Julian. I'd started taking women's groups there occasionally, hosting weekend retreats for female physicians dealing with burnout and career challenges. We'd sit on the deck, overlooking the Pacific, sharing stories about balancing demanding careers with personal lives, about setting boundaries and recognizing red flags, about rebuilding after relationships that had extracted more than they'd provided. I'd tell them about the booking confirmation email, about the surreal experience of discovering my husband's affair through my own investment property, about driving to Mendocino to conduct an inspection that had ended a marriage and exposed 8 months of lies. The story always resonated because every woman there had experienced some version of being underestimated or taken advantage of, had dealt with men who'd assumed female resources were available for male convenience without consequence. I'd sleep well in the cottage during those retreats, in the same bedroom where Julian and Simone had stayed, where their relationship had imploded under the weight of truth. The room had been redecorated since then, new bedding and furniture that held no memories of them. But even before the changes, I'd felt no attachment to their presence there. They'd been temporary, their romantic escape a brief moment that had ended in exactly the exposure it deserved. The cottage remained, solid and appreciating and mine, generating income and providing retreat space and existing as proof that I'd built something substantial independent of my marriage. Julian had thought he could use my property for his affair because he'd assumed my ownership was abstract, irrelevant, separate from anything that mattered to him. Instead, my ownership had been the exact mechanism of his exposure, the detail he'd overlooked that had brought everything crashing down. The booking confirmation had arrived at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, an automated email that had changed the trajectory of my life by revealing a truth I'd been too trusting to seek. What they didn't know was that the charming coastal cottage belonged to me, and I'd been watching the whole time.
You've just stepped into her revenge side, where every wound finds its justice, and every silence ends with truth. If her story struck a chord, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive. Another secret waits in the next video. See how her revenge begins.